This is part of COSI Connects Live. This, if you're a student in the K through 12 space, and welcome to all you grade 6ers to grade 12ers out there listening to this, and of course the teachers and chaperones, thank you for being part of this program. This is some of the stuff that we do really well here at COSI. Of course, you can come to our museum. We're opening it back up November 20th. It will be the safest place in Central Ohio. We have photo hydro ionization HVAC technology that will make sure you're breathing the cleanest air. So November 20th, plan your field trips, talk to your parents, talk to your teachers, your friends, come to COSI. That's the building. But the other thing we do really well is we make science come alive and we direct it and beam it to you. And that's what this COSI Connects Live is all about. I want to give a shout out to Jordan, our excellent person who puts all these programs together. What we do is we can beam this into your classroom like you're experiencing now, or we can beam this into your home. But we don't just beam you a video. That's what YouTube is for. We bring you experts and you can actually have live chats with them. How cool is that? And today's distinguished guest is none other than Dr. Katharine Hayhoe. Now, I need to get to my notes because I have to read her incredible title for her position. So get ready, folks. I'll read it and then I'll translate it. So we are with the climate scientist. She holds a position as a political science endowed professor in public policy and public law in the Department of Political Science. She's also the director of the Climate Center and an associate in the public health program of the Graduate School of Biomedical Sciences at Texas Tech University. She's also the principal investigator of the Department of Interior's South Central Climate Adaptation Science Center. She is incredible. The coolest part about her though, folks, she's American, but she's also Canadian. She's born in Canada, but she's here with us now in the US. I say that because I think you all know this. I'm born in Montreal, Canada as well, but I'm happy to be in the US. All right, having said that, all the cool things that her long title exemplifies speaks to her incredible diverse background. In undergrad, she studied physics. She did astrophysics, studying the universe and the stars, all this cool stuff. And then she realized that that was transferable and she migrated that over to her space and climate studies. And if you're not impressed by that, definitely check out her YouTube video. Absolutely incredible. 2.5 million, sorry, her TED Talk. 2.5 million views for that TED Talk. That's incredible. And go to her YouTube channel. She's gonna talk about a global, what is it?
Weirding.
There you go.
Global weirding.
Global weirding. Google it. Dr. Katharine Hayhoe. A pleasure to have you with COSI on COSI Connects Live. I know you got a great presentation for us, and then I'll field some questions from our students. Take it away.
Okay, that sounds great. It is fantastic to be with you here today. And I'm going to talk about climate change. So what I do very simply is I study what climate change means to us where we live. So often we think it's about the polar bears, but actually it affects us right here in Ohio and every other place that we live. But I want to start back at the beginning. And to do that, I'm going to share my slides with you. Just 1 minute. Okay. Did you know that 200 years ago, the average lifespan was 40 years? That means on average, I would be dead. Probably your teacher would be dead. Maybe even one or two of your parents would be dead by the time they reached age 40. Now, obviously, our lifespan is no longer 40 years. Now it's more like 80 years, which is great. It means I still have half my life in front of me. What was the number one reason that human lifespan doubled in just 200 years? The number one reason was the Industrial Revolution. So instead of living the way we used to 200 or 300 years ago, now we live much differently. And the reason we live much differently is because we figured out how to dig coal out of the ground and burn it to power our industry and our cars and our transportation and our electricity. And then of course now we use oil too, and we use natural gas. Just think of all the things that energy brings you. Imagine what your life would be like without a refrigerator. Your food would go bad in a day or less. Imagine if you didn't have electricity or light bulbs. You have to wake up with the sun and go to bed with the sun too. Or you just have candles or maybe some lanterns after dark. Imagine if we didn't have cars or airplanes or trains. And imagine all the medical advances that have happened since the 1800s. Back in the 1700s, they had doctors and they had surgeons, but they didn't know a lot. And a lot of people didn't even want to go to them because they were scared that they'd have a higher chance of dying. A lot has changed, and it's not just about technology. Back before the Industrial Revolution, we relied on animals for our transportation. If you did the laundry, it would take you all day to do the laundry by hand. And that was back when people only had 2 or 3 outfits each. Children as young as 5 years old had to work. They couldn't even go to school. And there was the horrible curse of slavery too, people owning other people and using them to do their work. Nowadays, thankfully, we have none of that. But you may have heard this, there's no free lunch. What do I mean by that? I mean that although coal and gas and oil have brought us a lot of benefits, there's a cost to them. What does that cost look like? Well, how do we get coal? One of the main ways in the US that we get coal is by cutting the tops off mountains. They do this in West Virginia, they do this in Kentucky, they even do it in southern Ohio. When you cut the tops off mountains, it allows a lot of toxins, things that are really bad for you, to come out of the rock and leach, as they say, into the water supply. And then the people living there have all kinds of health problems, including cancer and heart disease, because of the pollution from the mountaintop removal. How do we get our oil? A lot of our oil comes from offshore, but we know that we can have disasters. We can have things like the Deepwater Horizon disaster that happened in the Gulf of Mexico about 10 years ago. We can have ships that leak, and that just happened 2 months ago off the coast of Africa. There was an oil tanker that was leaking, and people from the island of Mauritius were actually trying to make like floating booms of human hair, because that's all they had, to try to collect the oil before it destroyed the wildlife, like you can see with this duck covered in oil here. So these are part of the prices that we pay for using fossil fuels. Then what happens when we burn coal and gas and oil? It produces air pollution. It produces air pollution that hurts some of the poorest people right here in Columbus and Ohio in the US, as well as on the other side of the world. And globally, air pollution contributes to almost 9 million premature deaths per year. Now, that sounds like a crazy big number, so let me break it down. As of this week, we have had 217,000 deaths from coronavirus in the US. That is a lot of deaths, and you might even know 1 or 2 people who've had it or have even died from it. I do myself. But did you know that air pollution kills 200,000 people on average, some years more, some years less, but on average, 200,000 people in the US every single year. Every year. Why aren't we talking about this? I think part of it is because we've just had it around for so long, but part of it is because the people who are most affected by it are the people who live in the poorest neighborhoods who can't afford to live somewhere better with cleaner air. Although in the US, according to the American Lung Association, 4 out of every 10 people live in areas with bad air. And there's even a connection to coronavirus. Did you know that if you've been living somewhere with bad air pollution, your lungs are already damaged? And so if you are exposed to coronavirus, you have a greater chance of getting it. And if you get it, you have a greater chance of getting sick from it and even dying. So I don't know the numbers for Ohio, but for example, in Chicago, 30% of the people who live in Chicago are Black. People who are Black are often disproportionately exposed to air pollution, because they live in neighborhoods where people, where there's more air pollution, as well as more landfills and more hazardous waste sites. And so in Chicago, even though only 30% of people in the city are African American, 70% of the deaths from coronavirus are African American. And the connection there is air pollution and fossil fuels. So when we look around the world and we say, well, there's still 1 billion people who live in energy poverty. They don't have electricity. They're living like we lived 200 years ago. Many people would say they need fossil fuels like we do. But we know now that fossil fuels have a huge price tag to them, and the poorest people are paying that price. Not only that, but the bottom line is fossil fuels are old school. We've been using fossil fuels. You know how long we've been using them? Since this guy. This is King Edward I of England. He lived in the 1200s and the 1300s. And he actually wrote the first piece of air pollution legislation in the world. I'm not kidding. He said, when my wife is living in the Tower of London, Queen Eleanor, that's a picture of the Tower of London back hundreds of years ago. He said, when my wife is in residence, she doesn't like it when you burn coal in the city because it produces such a terrible smog she can't breathe. So when she's living there, you are not allowed to burn coal within the city limits of London. And if you do, you will be killed. The penalty was death. But he said, if she's not in the Tower of London, go ahead and burn the coal. Because he didn't really care about the rest of the people, just himself and her. So that was how long we've had the problem of air pollution from coal, since the 1300s. Nowadays, though, telling people, oh, you need more fossil fuels, that's the only way you can get energy. It's kind of like telling people, you need more horses and buggies when we have brand new electric cars. We have new ways of getting energy now. And a lot of developing countries are leapfrogging or jumping right over the old technology to the new technology. If you go to a developing country these days, people have cell phones. They don't have old party line telephones like we used to have 50 years ago. And 70% of the new energy being installed around the world is clean energy. This is already happening. Why? Because it's the cheapest form of energy. Just this week, the International Energy Agency, that's the IEA there, just this week they confirmed that solar energy is the cheapest electricity in history. And in the US, solar energy plus batteries for storage, because I don't know if you know that the sun doesn't shine at night. Of course you know that. But you need energy at night too. So solar energy plus batteries in some places in the US is already cheaper than natural gas. Of course, the cheapest type of energy is the energy you don't use. And it turns out in the US, we are so wasteful with our energy that through efficiency alone, we could cut our carbon emissions in half, just through efficiency. So there's more that we can do. It isn't just solar and wind energy, it's just being more efficient with what we have. Now, you might say, okay, but you haven't even mentioned climate change yet. That's right, I haven't mentioned it yet, but now I'm going to, because this is the biggest part of the price tag from using fossil fuels. When we dig up coal and gas and oil and we burn it, it produces heat-trapping gases. Not air pollution, it produces that too, but it also produces heat-trapping gases, and that's why climate is changing. Now, let's just back up a few steps here. How do we know that climate is even changing? Because when we have a heat wave, people say, oh, a heat wave, it must be global warming. But then we have record cold and people say, oh, it's cold outside, where's global warming? To understand what climate change is, we have to understand the difference between weather and climate. Weather is what happens on a day or a week or even a year. You can have a cold day, a cold week, or even a cold year. It's like a single tree. What's climate? Climate is like a forest of trees. Climate is the weather on every day for at least 20 to 30 years. So over 20 to 30 years, you can have cold and hot, and you can have wet and dry, but climate is the average over that time. It's like the whole forest of trees. So when we scientists look at the planet, we look at every year, and on the left-hand figure there, every bar is a year, okay? And any bar that's colder than average is blue, and any bar that's warmer than average is red. So you can see some years are warmer and some are cooler, but what's been happening decade by decade by decade, what's been happening is the whole planet has been getting warmer. And it isn't just thermometers. when we look at glaciers that are disappearing, when we look at when cherry trees have been blooming in Japan, where they've kept a record for 1,100 years, when we look at how the land up in the Arctic is thawing and crumbling and people's homes are falling into the ocean, when we look at how deer ticks that carry Lyme disease, they used to be only down in the south, but now they're all through Ohio, they're even up into Canada. When we look around the whole world, do you know how many different lines of evidence there are showing that the planet is warming? 26,500. That's how we know that, yes, climate is changing. Well, so then you might say, okay, but how do we know that humans are responsible? Because we know it was warmer back when there was dinosaurs. And you're right, it was warmer back when there was dinosaurs. But it has never been this warm as long as we've had humans on the planet. So to see if humans are responsible, we have to look at the natural suspects first. And we know what they are because that's what we climate scientists study. We look at how the sun affects climate. We look at how natural cycles affect climate. And we look at how volcanoes affect climate. So could it be the sun or natural cycles or volcanoes that are causing our climate to warm? Let's see. First of all, the sun. Now, if the sun were causing us to warm, would the sun have to be getting brighter or dimmer? Brighter, right? You know, you have a switch on your lamp, you turn it up, right? You get more light. So when we look at the sun's energy, over the last 50 years, the sun's energy has been going down, not up. So if the sun were causing our temperature to change right now, we'd be getting cooler, not warmer. Can't be the sun. What about natural cycles, like El Nino? Could it be natural cycles? All that natural cycles like El Nino do is move heat around the climate system, like a teeter-totter or a seesaw. So a natural cycle can take heat from here and move it over here. Or it can take heat from the atmosphere and put it in the ocean. Or heat from the ocean and put it in the atmosphere. So is just one part of the planet getting warmer while another part gets cooler? We've had natural cycles before. And one of the biggest natural cycles happened back in the time of King Edward. Remember King Edward? He was the guy who said, if you burn coal while my wife is living in the Tower of London, you're all dead. Back in the time of King Edward, they had a natural cycle. It was called the medieval warm period. And here's what it looked like. It was when Greenland was named Greenland. And the Vikings took cruises there. Just kidding. This is a cartoon. It's not a real picture. Greenland was always covered in ice. It was always covered in ice. They just wanted people to move there because they had too many people in the Viking areas. And so they said, hey, come to Greenland. And then by the time they got to Greenland, they're like, oh my gosh, it's not Greenland, it's white. What am I going to do? Too late. But here's what it looked like. Here's what global temperature looked like, measured by natural thermometers like tree rings and ice cores back in those days. Over here by Greenland, it actually was a bit warmer than average. So this is why they could actually sail all the way across to Greenland, because there wasn't as much ice. And in fact, the Vikings even made it to Canada back then. And there's these old Viking settlements that they've dug up in Eastern Canada that you could go visit. But because this was a natural cycle, that heat had to come from somewhere. Where did it come from? Siberia. It wasn't the medieval warm period, it was the medieval cold period in Siberia, because it was a natural cycle, teeter-totter or seesaw. So what does today look like? This. The whole thing is warmer today. So that's how we know it is not a natural cycle. Now, if you've watched the Ice Age movies, you might also know that we have ice ages. So aren't we just getting warmer after the last ice age? When we look at the thermometer data, the natural thermometer data too, we see no, we are not just getting warmer after the last ice age. So 10,000 years ago, we were getting warmer after the last ice age, 10,000 years ago. And then our temperature stabilized. And then we started to get cooler. Why? Because according to ice age cycles, the next thing that should be coming is another ice age, which we don't want. But then the Industrial Revolution happened and boom, our temperature shot straight up. So not only are we getting warmer when we should be getting cooler, but it's happening 50 times faster than we got warmer after the last ice age. Yikes. The last natural suspect we have to cross off our list is volcanoes. Volcanoes produce a little tiny bit of heat trapping gases, like the amount that Ohio and Pennsylvania and Illinois produce. All the volcanoes in the world produce the same amount as about Ohio, Pennsylvania, and Illinois. But when you get a big volcanic eruption, it actually puts all of these particles in the atmosphere that act like an umbrella. What does an umbrella do? It reflects the sun's energy back to space and it cools the earth. So when we get a big volcanic eruption, it doesn't warm the earth, it cools it for about 1 or 2 years. It's not volcanoes. Now, our Global Weirding series on YouTube has one episode called, Isn't This Just a Natural Cycle? And it goes into all of this in more detail. So if you're interested, check that out on YouTube. But today, what we know is that climate is changing because of humans. How? Here's how. Now, give me the thumbs up if you can see this video. Can you see the video working? Okay, perfect. Here's how this works. Our planet, there's our happy planet, it has a natural blanket of heat trapping gases. So the sun's energy shines down and goes right through that blanket like a window. The earth absorbs the sun's energy and heats up, and it gives off heat energy that this blanket traps, just like a blanket keeps your body warm at night. So if we didn't have this blanket, our planet would be a frozen ball of ice with no life. So if this blanket's a good thing, then what's the problem? The problem is that by digging up and burning coal and gas and oil, we are wrapping an extra blanket around our planet that it does not need. And just like my grandma used to do when I stayed with her when I was little, she would sneak in every night and put an extra blanket on me. And I would wake up every night sweating, saying, Grandma, I didn't need this extra blanket. In the same way, we're wrapping an extra blanket around our planet, and that's why it's running a fever. All right, so climate is changing and humans are responsible. But why does it matter to us, right? Why does it matter? We agree that adults, I should say, agree, not kids. I think the kids' numbers would be different here. Adults agree that global warming will harm plants and animals. This shows people's opinions across the whole US, and anywhere that's orange means that more than half of the people would say yes. And the darker orange, the more people would say yes. So 70% of adults think that global warming will harm plants and animals, and 71% think it will harm future generations, like your kids, your grandkids, your great-great-grandkids. Most people, 65%, think it will harm people in other countries, developing countries. But then when we get down to, is it going to affect people in the US? We're down to 60%. And then they said, do you think it will harm you? And everybody says, no, I don't think it will harm me. Because when we think about global warming, what's the number one picture we have in our head? The number one picture is a polar bear, right? And so we say, sure, it'll affect the polar bear, but not me. Is that true? Well, it will affect the polar bear, that is true. But after the polar bear, who's next? Us. Yes, exactly. We are next. Why? Because wherever we live on this planet, we get crazy weather. We get heat waves, droughts, hurricanes, floods, ice storms. Wherever we live, we get these. It's like rolling a double six on our weather dice. And we always have a chance of rolling a double six naturally. But what climate change is doing is it's sneaking in when we're not looking, and it's taking one of those numbers and it's replacing it with a 6. So then we've got 3 6s, then we've got 4 6s, then we've got a 7, and we're like, what is happening? That's climate change. It's like a baseball player on steroids. A baseball player always has a chance of hitting a home run, but if they take steroids, they have a lot bigger chance of hitting a home run. That's what climate change is doing to you in Ohio. Why do we care about a changing climate? Because it takes all of the risks we already face today and it's making them worse. Like what? Well, we already know that heavy rain, you know, when it rains really, really hard, heavy rain is already increasing 42% across the whole Midwest. Why does that matter? Because heavy rain causes floods. And floods matter because they affect your home, they affect roads, they affect your school, they affect farmers, they affect the economy. Floods matter. Sea levels rising. Why does it matter? Because people's homes are getting flooded. In Miami, they're actually raising the streets by 2 feet so they won't flood. And all kinds of beachfront properties are losing their value because of sea level rise. The oceans are getting warmer. Why does that matter? Because hurricanes are getting stronger and they're getting bigger and they're getting a lot more damaging. And it's estimated, for example, that 40% of the rain during Hurricane Harvey wouldn't have happened if the same hurricane had happened 100 years ago. That's a lot of damages. And then you've probably seen the pictures of the wildfires, right? Crazy wildfires out west. We always get wildfires, but as climate is changing, they're getting bigger and bigger and bigger. This shows when the biggest wildfires have happened. Only 3 of them happened before 2000. Only 3 of the biggest wildfires happened before the year 2000. And then a whole ton of them happened from 2000 through 2019. And then count them, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 5 of the biggest wildfires in California history happened this year. And this year isn't even finished. That's how climate change is loading the dice against us. And not just us. What were the headlines in Australia? Wildfires in January too. Wildfires are getting worse because of climate change. As the Prime Minister of Dominica said, which was one of the islands that was hit by the hurricane season a couple of years ago, he said, to deny climate change is to deny a truth that we have just lived. And when we look around the world, what countries are most vulnerable to climate change? The poorest countries. And they're already being affected. So already the gap between the richest and poorest countries has gotten 25% bigger already because of climate change. That's already happened. How is this happening? Well, in Bangladesh, they're seeing massive floods. They've had 1/3 of their entire country underwater. That is not normal. In Haiti, they've had stronger hurricanes that have devastated, in some places, 90% of their homes, just wiped them out. In Syria, they've had stronger droughts that have led to refugee crises like we've had the last few years. Why do we care about a changing climate? Not just because it affects us, it's because it affects the poorest people in the world the most, right here at home, as well as on the other side of the world. So I want to end with this last question, and then we're going to take your questions. So get ready. You can type them in on Facebook. We're going to take your questions next. But the last question I want to answer is this: what can we do about this? Because there's no good me telling you about a problem and then not telling you what we can do. Well, it turns out these maps actually have the answer to the most important thing that you can do. Remember, I showed you this one before. Do adults think it's going to affect them, global warming is going to affect them personally? People say no. There's one more map that's bluer. You know what that one is? Do you ever talk about it? Nobody talks about this. What do you talk about? You talk about what matters to you. So if you never talk about it, why would we ever want to fix it? Why don't we talk about it? We don't think it matters to us, and we don't think there's anything we can do to fix it. Well, now you know it does matter to us. And you have lots of examples I just talked about. Flooding, the algae blooms in Lake Erie, stronger heat waves, bigger hurricanes. You know what's happening. But what you don't know is what we can do to fix it. And that's exactly what we need to talk about. Why climate change matters to us and what can we do to fix it. So I'm going to give you a bunch of examples. Ready? Here we go. This is fun. In fact, this is my favorite thing. Did you know that the city of Columbus is going to cut its carbon emissions to 0 by 2050. And Ohio State is going to do it too. Those are really cool things that you can tell people about. Did you know that businesses like Walmart and Apple and Microsoft are also cutting their carbon emissions and powering themselves by clean energy? That's something amazing that you can tell people about. Did you know that whole countries are cutting their coal use or saying we're not going to invest in fossil fuel use anymore? Canada, Ireland, Finland, the UK. Did you know that farmers are part of climate solutions? That farmers can actually put these heat trapping gases back in the soil where we want it because it helps us grow better crops. And farmers can have wind and solar on their land and it can actually help them make money. Farmers are a big part of the solution. Faith-based organizations are a big part of the solution. Catholics, Protestants, evangelicals, Muslims, Hindus, Buddhists, they all have plans to make a difference on climate change. And that's awesome. So whatever type of church you go to, that type of church has a plan. Your specific church might not, but your denomination or your type of church does. Schools are acting. Did you know that all kinds of schools, there's already almost 6,000 schools in the US that are powered by clean energy. You can reduce your food waste. They're doing things like collecting used cooking oil and turning it into biofuel to power the school bus. There's amazing things that schools are doing and you can learn about them and tell people about them. Did you know that kids are doing things? Kids are inventing new clean energy technology. Kids are suing the federal government for the right to a safe future. And most of all, kids are speaking out. As this headline says, one of the largest environmental protests, the school strike for climate, is being led by kids. So whoever you are, you can make a difference, and kids are showing us how to do that. Now, at this point, you might say, sure, but we know that kids aren't the best person to talk about it. What about celebrities like Leonardo DiCaprio? Well, it turns out that when you rank who's the best person to talk about climate change, celebrities like Leo are number 10. Then you might say, oh, well, I heard that the Pope is saying a lot of good stuff about climate change, and he is. The Pope is number 7, and other religious leaders. Then you might say, okay, well, what about scientists like you? Well, we scientists are pretty good at talking about climate change. We're number 2. Who's number 1? You. You're number 1. What do I mean by you? Friends and family, people we know, are the number 1 best person. And in fact, kids are really, really good at it, and that's what science has shown. So what would I talk about? Talk about awesome solutions like I just talked about. If you want more, go to drawdown.org. Maybe you could put a link to that in the Facebook chat, drawdown.org. They talk about amazing solutions like educating women and girls and cutting food waste. Did you know that we throw away 40% of the food we produce in the US? And if food waste were its own country, it would be number 3 biggest producer of heat trapping gases in the world. Reducing food waste is a simple thing we can all do to make a difference. And here's why talking matters, because if we don't talk about it, why would we care? And if we don't care, why would we ever do anything about it? So the most important thing you can do is talk about it, because talking really does make a difference. And talking is the first step to saying, what can our school do? What can our family do? What can our community do to help fix this? Thank you.
Wow, that was so fantastic, Dr. Hayhoe. Ladies and gentlemen, you are listening to COSI Connects Live. For your teachers and educators out there, that's formerly known as IVC, our interactive video conferencing. It's now called COSI Connects Live because COSI connects you to a universe of science. We're listening to Frederic Bertley from COSI, I'm the President and CEO, but more importantly, Dr. Katharine Hayhoe, our official, amazing guest who broke down climate change so well so that all of us have no excuse but to help make a difference. This was really fantastic. Dr. Hayhoe, as you mentioned in your remarks, we're going to take questions from the guests. If you have a question, please put it in the chat. And if you want us to call out your name and your school, by all means do so. Before we get to those in the chat, though, I do have some questions that were submitted earlier, Dr. Hayhoe, from different schools throughout Columbus. And so I'm going to read you just some of the names because I gave the questions, but you've answered a lot of the questions, and I want to try to get through as many as possible. So first, this is from sixth graders. Thank you, sixth graders, from Metro STEM School in Columbus, Ohio. So Sonia Bay and Avalia asked, is there anything that kids can do to help? And what can I do at home in my everyday life to help stop climate change? And I know you talked about it, but if you can give me a 30-second response to those two kiddos, that'll be great.
I absolutely can. I'm glad you asked that question. So I already talked about a lot of examples, but I want to give you two more things, okay? First of all, in our Global Weirding series, and they'll put a link right there on Facebook, it's just globalweirdingseries.com. We have one episode called I'm Just a Kid, What Can I Do? And if you give that episode a watch, it has a lot more examples of what kids can do. And then what you can also do is you can measure your ecological footprint using a footprint calculator. You can see if everybody lived like you, how many planets would we need? But you can also see what you can do to reduce your family's carbon footprint through things like not driving as much, or next time you buy a car, buy a more efficient car, or maybe even a plug-in car, reducing your food waste, eating less meat and more vegetables, using LED light bulbs, which save you money, and all kinds of other things like that. So check out a footprint calculator, and I'll give you a link here that they'll put in the Facebook chat. And also check out our Global Weirding episode on I'm Just One Kid, What Can I Do? Because the answer is a lot.
That is fantastic. And again, just for the audience, you talked about a footprint. You know, there's basketball players with big feet and they make a footprint on the planet. Just explain a little more to our audience what a carbon footprint or an energy footprint means.
Yes. So the best link for that is footprint.org. And what that means is how much carbon do we produce? How much water and food and resources do we consume? And if everybody lived like us, if everybody on the whole planet lived like us, how many planets would we need? And the sad thing is I live a fairly frugal life, and we'd still need 4 planets if everybody lived like me. And the average American, we need 7 planets if everybody lived like the average American. Now, it isn't, a lot of that is just built into our system. You know, you live somewhere where I don't even have public transportation where I live, so I can't even take a bus to school. And I live too far away, so either I have to bike, for about, I think it would take me about an hour if I was biking, or I have to drive. So I got a little plug-in car so I can drive. So that's why we don't just need to change ourselves. We need to make the change at the level of our school. We need to make the change at the level of our city. We need to make the change at the level when we go to university, of our university or college, and at the level of our whole country. And kids are really leading the way in all of those areas. It's amazing.
That is fantastic. Okay, moving right along. Another grade sixer, we have Chase Washington. Chase asks, if glaciers melt into the oceans, what is the effect on the temperature? What's the effect on climate change?
So the biggest effect of land-based ice, like glaciers and ice sheets, going into the ocean is all of that water raises the level of the ocean. So the ocean level is rising because, for 2 reasons. Warmer water takes up more heat, and 90% of the heat being trapped by that extra blanket I talk about is going into the ocean. 90%. So all of that warmer water takes up more space because the molecules are moving faster. You probably learned that in science class. But also when land-based ice melts, all that water is going to the ocean too. Now, over the past 100 years, it's about 50-50. Half of sea level rise is because the ocean is taking up more space as it warms, and half of sea level rise is because the glaciers and ice sheets are melting. But Greenland is now melting about 6 times faster than it was in the 1990s. And so sea level rise is not linear. Sea level rise is exponential. It's happening faster and faster. And that's because Greenland and Antarctica are melting faster and faster.
Wow, great. Folks, you are listening to Dr. Katharine Hayhoe on COSI Connects Live. That's the Center of Science and Industry in Columbus, Ohio. We love bringing incredible scientists who not only can talk the really high scientific talk, but they can explain it to you so you can absolutely understand and be conscious and do something about it. I'm going to read through about 4 different names, Dr. Hayhoe, because they asked similar questions, and then I'll get the question to you. So Maha Nagarajan, Ada Strasberg, Carmen Kimmel, F.A. Gachman and Jihan Jamal, they asked a combination of one, what things are the governments doing to solve global warming? You talked a little bit about the kind of goals, but talk a little bit more about that. What would the future look like if we don't do anything about it? And a third kind of related question, we talked about glaciers already. What does climate change cause wildfires? You talked about that. So basically, what are governments doing, and what would happen if we actually didn't do anything about it?
That is a great question. And we have a global weirding episode called Is It Too Late? Because a lot of people want to know that too. Here's the situation we have. We've been digging up and burning coal since King Edward, right? And we've been doing more and more of that as we go through time. In fact, half of our carbon emissions have been emitted during most people's lifetimes that are alive now, just the last 30 years, half of our carbon emissions. So it's kind of like we've been smoking cigarettes already for 30 or 40 years. So some amount of lung damage is already there. If you've been smoking a long time, and if you know somebody's been smoking a long time, you know they can't run as fast as they used to. They might have some breathing problems. They might even need extra oxygen. But we don't have lung cancer and we're not dead. So the best time to stop smoking is now, and the best time to fix climate change is now. And I look at the future, and so what I know, and I do this in my research, I actually study the future. And I know that there is all the difference in the world between a future where we keep on using fossil fuels and a future where we're powered by clean energy, where we get clean air, we get clean water, we get cheaper energy than we have today, because clean energy is actually cheaper now. Isn't that insane? Most people think fossil fuels are cheaper, but they're not. That's what difference our choices today make. And so it's never too late to make a difference. And our future would look so much better with clean energy. It would be much more equitable. People who are poorer could afford electricity. They wouldn't have to worry about running the AC when it's hot out. Again, it would clean up our air. So we wouldn't have 200,000 deaths every year from air pollution. Poor countries would be able to get much cheaper electricity than they can today. And it's not going to run out on us, because fossil fuels are eventually going to run out, but the sun and the wind just keep on blowing, keep on shining. The tides keep going, geothermal energy too. It's all part of the same thing, and it's all part of a better future.
That's fantastic. You're listening to COSI Connects Live, the Center of Science and Industry here in Central Ohio. We are listening to Dr. Katharine Hayhoe, an incredible climate scientist based in Texas at the University, or Texas Tech University. And I want to share that because she's Canadian and now she's in Texas. And a little plug-in for being a scientist. If you study science, the world can open up. You can travel anywhere in the world. You can do all kinds of great research. You can have a great future just by knowing and studying a little bit of science, as testified by our current special guest, Dr. Katharine Hayhoe. All right, another really cool question came from a homeschool student. Unfortunately, I don't have his or her name. And he or she says, how can we work on having a zero carbon footprint at home? So us on the individual level with our families, our brothers and sisters, our cousins, aunts and uncles, how can we have zero? Not kind of zero, how can we get to zero?
I love that question. So here's the answer for us living in North America today with the system that we have. Today, the answer is reduce everything we can and then offset the rest. What's an offset? An offset actually mentions Caden's question, because he had a question too. An offset is doing something that takes carbon out of the atmosphere and puts it into trees and puts it into soil, which is where we want it, because carbon in trees and carbon in the soil is actually really good. So anybody who follows Mr. Beast on YouTube knows about the Trillion Trees challenge, that he was going to plant 1 trillion trees, which I think he did pretty quickly. And I use a organization, a nonprofit called Climate Stewards, where they work in poor countries and they help to restore ecosystems. They help people so they don't have to cut down trees to burn, to cook with, but they provide them with solar energy and electricity that they can use. And they put carbon, they help with what they call, it's kind of a long term, regenerative agriculture, which is a really long word for smart farming that puts carbon back in the soil. And this stuff is not rocket science. Here where I live in Lubbock, Texas, we had a team of grade sixers. So the youngest people listening here today, we had a team of grade sixers who won a national science fair back in July for a program called Carbon Keepers, which is all about talking to local farmers and doing experiments to see how we can put carbon back in the soil. So in your home, step on the carbon scales, figure out, there's a really cool thing called the Cool Calculator from the University of California at Berkeley. I'll put a link here that they can share on Facebook. So you step on the carbon scales, you measure your carbon footprint, you figure out, okay, we could work on reducing our electricity use, we could work on our transportation, we could work on our food. But in North America, logistically, we can't get to zero right now because we need the whole system to change. And that's why using our voice is so important. We need, when we flip our switch, we need that to be clean electricity. We shouldn't even have to have solar panels on our roof. We should just have clean electricity when we flip the switch. We should be able to buy electric cars that are cheaper than regular cars. That should just happen. And for that, we need system-wide change. So we do everything we can, but then offsetting the rest is a great plan because it helps to take carbon out of the soil through working with farmers, through working with ecological conservation, through working with trees, and that has all kinds of other benefits like cleaning up the air, helping the natural environment too, which is also being harmed by climate change. All of that works together. And let me give you a couple links in the chat here that you can learn more. Go ahead with the next question while you do that.
That is terrific. Listen, folks, for you grade 7 to grade 12 students, you better step up your A game because the grade 6 students are winning competitions to help save our planet. Good stuff. We can all play our role. You're listening to Dr. Katharine Hayhoe, an incredible climate scientist who is sharing her wisdom with us, and more importantly, sharing what we can do as individuals to better impact our planet. You're listening to us on COSI Connects Live, our interactive video conferencing program, beaming stuff to you in your classrooms, in your homes, wherever you live, learn, and lounge. COSI's got some great stuff for you. And by the way, I know you miss us physically. We will be open November 20th, providing you the safest, incredibly climate change kind of calculated clean air using photohydroionization and other cool stuff. In short, making sure you have a safe experience in our building starting November 20th. Make sure you check out our website, cosi.org. With that, we have a few more questions. I want to read a great question from David Ramsden. He says, what is the time lag between CO2 emissions and visible effects of those emissions, i.e. additional effects are already locked in? Talk a little bit about that. You must be a budding senior in high school. That was a great question, sir.
Yes, and that kind of expands on, what happens if we do nothing.
Mm-hmm.
So the changes we are seeing today is pretty much because of all the carbon we produced about 30 years ago. So it's kind of like if you ate 15 fast food hamburgers every day for a year, you wouldn't see the impacts on day one. You're right. You would see the impacts after a few months, after a few years even, and eventually on down to the end of your life. Similarly, if you sat there and you smoked 5 packs of cigarettes today, you'd probably be choking by the end of it, but you wouldn't see the lung damage until later. So in the same way, we produce a lot of carbon today, and we start to see the impacts build up year after year after year. What happens if we do nothing? The planet's going to survive. It's not about saving the planet. It's about saving human civilization and about 30% of the world's species that would go extinct too. Why is our civilization so vulnerable? It's because our civilization is built on a pretty stable climate. The temperature of the planet has only varied by a few tenths of a degree. It's been as stable as a human body's temperature over the course of human civilization. So our agriculture, our food, our water, our energy, our socioeconomics, even our geographic borders, they're all drawn based on a stable climate. And if climate starts to change, our civilization, our food systems, our water systems, our economies are going to start breaking down. That's what's at risk. It's us. Like I said, after the polar bear, we're next.
Dr. Hayhoe, that was fantastic. And I love that analogy about that small temperature range, just like our human bodies, because everybody on the screen can relate to when they get sick and they get a temperature. We're just talking about a tiny blip in your human biology temperature. But guess what? You feel super sick, you're sweating, you're in a fetal position, you don't know what to do. Well, that's the same thing with climate change. We're just talking about small variations can have a big impact on our planet. So absolutely. I want to follow up with one of the questions. Again, David brought back to our attention the idea about what governments are doing. And then you touched on it in your talk, but share a little more about what governments are doing in terms of helping to do their part as we do our part as individuals.
Governments are doing a lot. And you know who's leading the way? Cities. Cities are leading the way. all kinds of cities have zero carbon targets. So Columbus obviously has one. The city of Houston just announced one. And I don't know if you know much about Houston, but it's a really big city. I think it's fourth largest in the US. And that's where all the big oil and gas companies live. All their headquarters are in Houston. So Houston has a zero carbon target. The city of Dallas is already running off 100% clean energy. Cities all over the world are saying we want to be carbon free and we're going to make sure it happens. But they're not alone. We also have the Paris Agreement, which every country in the world signed. The US is saying it wants to pull out, and it can officially pull out a few days before the November election. That's when it would be official. But if they want back in, they can get back in 30 days. Now, even though the current president is saying he doesn't want to be in the Paris Agreement with the whole rest of the world, did you know that there are cities and states and businesses and universities and tribal nations, Native Americans, that make up 50% of US emissions that are still in on the Paris Agreement? So even if the president says he doesn't want to be, people below the level of the president, like I said, tribal nations, cities, states, they can still be in, and they are. Other governments, like in Canada, they're putting a price on carbon. So you can still produce carbon if you want to, but you have to pay for the damages. And so if you decide I want to buy a car that doesn't produce as much carbon because it's more efficient or it's electric, you actually save money, and you even get money back in your taxes for it. So people are making money off saving carbon with the price on carbon. And then other companies are phasing out coal, or they're saying that we're not going to sell regular cars anymore in 10 years. And let me ask you this. Do you know which country in the world has more wind and solar and clean energy than any other country? China. Do you know which country has more green jobs than any other country? India. And in the US, do you know what is the fastest growing job in the whole US for the last 5 years? Well, it turns out there's two. They've been competing with each other. The two fastest growing jobs in the US for the past 5 years have been either solar technician or wind energy technician. And there are more jobs in the solar energy industry than in the coal industry in the US. So things are changing. And frankly, saying we want to still use horses and buggies when everybody else in the world has a car is just ridiculous. That's what saying we want to use fossil fuels when we have clean energy is like.
That is fantastic. And I love the fact you touched on the job piece, because one of the other important things with COSI Connects and Connects Live and STEM education is that the available of all kinds of great jobs for our kiddos as they grow up are huge if you have some kind of STEM discipline. So, and you don't have to have a PhD like Dr. Hayhoe. You can get a 2-year community college degree in some type of science or tech field and have a great income to take care of your family. Of course, you can get a bachelor's, master's, and then maybe even a PhD. But absolutely, studying science, understanding science can open a gateway to take care of all of your family and have a wonderful future. You are listening to COSI Connects Live, our digital portal to beam great content and even better people to your classroom, to your home. You're listening to Dr. Katharine Hayhoe from Texas Tech University, an incredible top-notch climate scientist. And we're at COSI. We'll be opening our doors November 20th. We want to see you in person. Dr. Hayhoe, this has been phenomenal. I want you to have the last word, but before I get to that, folks, if you like this kind of programming, go to cosi.org. Check out COSI Connects Live. You can book it for your schools. You can book it for your individual home. We have incredible programming on a suite of industries. I want to kick it back to Dr. Hayhoe, but before I do so, she talked about it wasn't rocket scientist. I want you audience to remember she did study astrophysics in undergrad. So if it was rocket scientist, you are hearing from the right person right now. Dr. Hayhoe, this has been a phenomenal program, but I want to give you the last word to all the kids and parents and teachers and the public who are listening to this program right now. The floor is yours.
Okay. We often think that to care about climate change, we have to be a certain type of person. Like we have to be an environmentalist, or we have to vote a certain way, or we have to care about certain things. But the only reason we care about climate change is because it affects everything we already care about. It affects our food and our water and the air that we breathe. It affects the things that we love doing. It affects the birds and the plants and all the animals we see around us. It affects the economy and jobs and money. It affects everything. So that's why to care about climate change, you don't have to be a certain type of person. You only have to be one thing. And I'm pretty sure you're already that. And that is a human who lives on planet Earth.
That is fantastic. What incredible, inspirational closing remarks. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Katharine Hayhoe. A virtual round of applause for her brilliance and taking the time to share in this cool COSI Connects Live program brought to you by COSI.org. Will be open November 20th. I'd like to give shout outs, Dr. Hayhoe. I do want to give a shout out to Mr. David Ramsden, who asked those great questions. And he said, that was brilliant, Katharine. So thank you very much for coming on. Lastly, we were going to put on, prior to coronavirus, an environmental educational summit with the media in January of 2021. Of course, we've pivoted, but when we do that in person, you will be the first person on our invitation list. We want to bring you to Central Ohio so the kiddos and the adults who are listening to you today can meet you in person and hear more about your wisdom. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for being part of this program. I'm Dr. Frederic Bertley, President and CEO of COSI. We'll be open November 20th, providing you the safest, coolest indoor STEM experience. Dr. Katharine Hayhoe, thank you for joining us on this program. You take care and have a great day, everyone else.
Thank you so much.
You're very welcome.